What is this, just a light novel channel now? Bitch, it might be. In all seriousness, I will be making regular videos as well, but I'm working pretty hard on getting the KUSOMEGA physical version put together. I recently put out that video where I asked for artists, and within about 2 days, I had all of the art positions filled on my book, and I spent a bunch of time creating a storyboard for the 12-page comic that initially was just going to be a stretch goal that I wasn't even going to ask anybody to work on, but because one of the comic artists who already produced the Byla and Crom full-color comic, I released it on Twitter. You can kind of get a sense of what the comics that are going to be in the finished book will look like through that, but I already put that out so that you could get a sense of it, but then after that went and storyboarded another 12-page comic, which the same artist is going to be handling in the physical release, and in the process of doing all that, I had a ton of thoughts about the project and my feelings on it so far, and so I wrote this extremely long piece, which I released as a blog post on the website for KUSOMEGA. But I wanted to go ahead and read it here because obviously a super long blog post is not going to get, as many people checking it out as a simple vlog where I read that blog post so that you can just listen to it in the background instead of having to spend 20-30 minutes scrolling through this thing. I've always been a big fan of reading like devlogs or things like that of people who are working on projects that I'm following. I haven't followed a ton of projects online that have that kind of thing, but anytime I have, I will typically read through the person's stuff, or listen to it. And I figured there are some people who would probably be interested in these thoughts. If you're not, then just don't watch the video, bro, because it's not going to be that interesting. But more so than just being for people who are already fans of KUSOMEGA, I also wanted to sort of give some insight for people who maybe don't care about the project itself, but would be interested in my thoughts on creating a project and doing something, a big art piece that has a lot of evolution in it. So we'll go ahead and read this. Alrighty, balls deep in adventure, KUSOMEGA design blog number 1. A couple of sentences into writing KUSOMEGA, I knew it was going to be a bigger project than anticipated. I started writing about 10 minutes after having the idea, expecting to churn out a single chapter and move on. But through the happenstance of needing to leave the house that day and taking May to the library so she could study, I continued, and by the end of the day, I finished the first volume. My excitement over this completion was electrifying. I've been trying to write light novels ever since discovering and falling in love with them in 2005, but my attempts only reached different stages of failure. For years, I dedicated myself wholly to media analysis until I could understand what I liked about the things I liked and what I hated about other shit. Now I finally return to writing with the confidence that even if I still have a long way to go developing my skills mechanically, I at least have some idea of what I'm trying to do. I suspect many will view my career thus. I completed my cult-beloved shitpost book. I wrote this light novel in like a day. It sucks and I hate it, but if it gets an anime adaptation, I'll say it was a masterpiece, which opened me up to writing fiction again. And then a couple of years later, I wrote another light novel in a day, and I ran with it. In truth, I started and failed to continue a whole ton of fiction over these last 3 years. I think I've always been better at writing from prompts than from the void. It's easy for me to project myself and my worldview onto things. No matter what, I'll write my own story about any idea. My own ideas are these nebulous clouds whose appeal I can't easily recognize. When someone pitches the appeal of a thing up front, it's like I've been giving a fill in the blank. And so, with the excitement that I felt over the successful completion of my book, compounded by the very kind reception it received, I conceived of the basic story outline for all 4 volumes and the whole plot of Volume 2 immediately. I was ready to charge through the entirety of KUSOMEGA guns blazing, but I also felt invested enough in the project that even if I had to sit it on the back burner for a while, I still thought I'd come back to it and follow through to the end. It was apparent not only that I would have to plan a physical release, as people had already been asking me to do for the last book, but I didn't want to make that one my first published book because long stretches of it aren't very good. But also, I also knew I was going to have to involve a ton of artists, because the first volume generated an unexpected deluge of fan art. I suspect that most people won't think too much of my illustrations for this series, but for me, the illustrative element has gradually become massively integral to the project as a whole. Over the last few years, I've begun to have a renewed interest in illustration by way of getting interested in storyboarding. Even if I can't realize the visions in my head to a high level of technical quality, as long as I can convey a story through the arrangements and relationships of visual components, I can deliver something illustrative which others can connect to. The emergence and staying power of One has been a beacon for me as an illustrator. While One Punch Man's makeover was undoubtedly what allowed it to reach the heights of popularity that it has, what made the original webcomic excellent in spite of its shoddy art was not only the excellent core conceit of the story, but One's awesome sense of visual composition. When I saw how striking his images were, even with low technical drawing skills, and how that naturally transitioned into the more advanced final version, I felt like I could do that very kind of collaborative visual art. Seeing Tsugumi Oba's storyboards and how Takeshi Obata adapted them in Bakuman was also a huge wake-up call. With my character designs for KUSOMEGA, I prioritized getting across the feeling of a character over actually trying to draw them well. This was easy to accomplish by simply pulling visual elements from characters whom I felt had similar feelings to the ones I wanted for these characters, and then modifying the most easily modifiable parts of their design. For Exia, I used a fan art of Felt from ReZero for reference, and then gave her a hairstyle partially based on the red-haired girl from Gabriel Dropout. Aether in the text was imagined based on the isekai goddess trope and characters like Aqua from Konosuba or Restart from Cautious Hero, but since she's got a bit more of a regal bearing, I modeled her visually after the main girl from Drakengard 3, which I have an awesome poster of above my desk. Baika and Baila were just straight up inspired by the blonde twins from Dr. Stone, and it shows in Baika's design, even though I actually used a fan art of Android 18 for my reference. Personality-wise, these characters diverged pretty hard from their forebears, and I think it shows in the ways that others have interpreted them in their art. Even if they were made using references just like any other halfway decent drawing I've made up to that point, designing these characters was a huge turning point for me as an artist, because in at least the cases of Aether and Exia, I had managed to make them just distinct enough from their influences to stand out as their own designs, and people loved them. There was boatloads of fan art for both characters based purely on the strength of their designs. You can tell because even though Baika and Aether had equally very little development over the course of the story, one of them barely got drawn at all, and it was the one that everyone could tell the inspiration for immediately. Once I saw these characters realized in more legitimate anime art styles, along with many other fascinating interpretations, I became really excited to design future characters for the series. Right away, I knew that I needed to add a Beast Girl lolly, as well as a hot psychic girl, through whom I could expand my takeaway from rewatching the Sabrina arc in the original Pokemon anime. I started writing Volume 2 the next night after releasing Book 1, but then I became struck with a sort of guilt. First of all, I was late on Patreon rewards, and I still am. And I had other plans with friends which started to look promising that I wanted to expedite, such as content. And I had to continue making videos that people like for my main anime YouTube channel. With the end of the decade coming around, I threw myself into making crowd-pleasing end-of-the-decade lists for a bit, had some other ideas, made some promises in various places that I would cut off my legs if I didn't finish Volume 2 by the end of January, and then was reminded of those promises as soon as I woke up on the last day of January, and thus decided, fuck it, I'm putting everything on hold until this thing is finished. Now it's 15 days later, and guess what? I sure didn't stop! This wasn't what I meant. I finished Volume 2 that night. It took 2 days instead of 1 to make the audiobook and draw the art because the book was twice as long as the first, and I also needed to use the launch of this book to promote my initiative to have it physically adapted in as near a future as possible. After all, I'm chasing one of the most elusive phenomena of the Web 2.0 ocean, the internet hype wave. Like I said before, I was ready to churn through the rest of KUSOMEGA back when I finished Volume 1, but I felt guilty. Both of those feelings remain, but in taking the next step forward and actually completing the second volume, the scope of my feelings towards the story have only tripled, just as it has in length. The more of it I write and plan out, the more fleshed out my own understanding of the characters and story become, and the more excited I get about trying to show you all what this whole thing is building towards. When you can already see something in your mind and you just have to make it happen, and you have to ask people to be patient and follow along as you walk that path and try not to falter or fuck it up for anyone, it puts a lot on your shoulders. The more time you spend on this thing, the more of it will have been wasted in the eyes of people who don't think you pulled it off. Maybe they hated it from the start, even if only because it took you away from the other things you could have been working on. Or maybe they're feeling soured when the story went in a direction they weren't impressed with. Or when the quality of your writing just wasn't enough to deliver on the promise of your premise in their eyes. I will inevitably lose people at every step of the way, but it's okay because I get to see many of them leave their exit polls. There are many things I already know will be hiccups to the enjoyment of different audiences. Some of those things I haven't learned to avoid or didn't in time. I don't care to heavily revise my stories because I become extremely attached to the version of events which I've already transcribed as the actual version of what happened, only feeling the need to correct plot holes and inconsistencies where they spring up, and then more often through justification than through revision. It's difficult to truly fix something broken in a story without completely starting the structure back from the beginning, or at least pruning back an infected branch. While I've written plenty of stories where the stem couldn't develop enough leaves to catch light from the start, KUSOMEGA is completely planned. It's just a matter of delivering it as best I can, as fast as I can, using the lessons I learn along the way to make it hopefully better and better as it goes, and then taking everything I learn from it into the future with me. To that end, if all I wanted was a series of written novels, I could probably sit back and crank through books 3 and 4 in a week. Don't tempt me. But in the course of the past 2 weeks, my understanding of what I'm building has developed in a more roundabout way, and started to grow whole, healthy branches apart from the main trunk of the light novel series. I want to bring KUSOMEGA to fruition as a full-grown, beautiful, sturdy adult tree that can chill in the back of a small section of pop culture's mind and toss about for a couple years before taking its resting place comfortably on a respectable media shelf alongside hopefully the likes of Zaregoto, Asura Girl, No Game No Life, and yeah, fuck it, ReZero, right where it belongs. A physical edition of the book was the obvious first step, and I announced right from the get-go my intention to hire artists to do proper light novel-style illustrations as well as variant covers for the physical release. But where Mind Expansion meme truly happened was when Good Vibrations came to me on Twitter, proposing his desire to create a full-blown comic book adaptation of KUSOMEGA with me writing and him drawing. I will say right away that I have no intention of penning a full-bore adaptation of KUSOMEGA to manga because the story is deliberately crafted in a way which takes advantage of what can be done stylistically in the written medium. Even creating the audiobook is a fairly difficult translation to nail down, and only possible because I've been training my voice and reading scripts and doing podcasts for the last decade. While I do think it's possible that the story could have a successful translation to manga, it would be a massive and extremely time-consuming task and ultimately nowhere near as interesting as simply writing new manga. And it's right when I had that thought that I had that thought. I'll just make a new manga set in this world that he can draw, I thought. Then it became, actually, what if I storyboarded 12 1- and 2-page comics covering every character and idea in the series that I want to expand on a little bit? The best way I can communicate my excitement over this idea is through anecdote. When I released Volume 1, I was asked by several artists if I had any guidelines for Baila's design, since I never gave her much of a proper description in the first book and didn't draw any art of her. Baila is obviously set up as an aesthetically recognizable character. Her main trait, which gets mentioned in the book, is her upturned eyes, and we know that she's mostly identical to her sister, but we don't know what she's wearing or enough about her personality to know the kinds of expressions she might make or stories she might appear in. Because of this, even though she's conceptually an aesthetically appealing character whom people would be curious about, no one ever made any fan art of her. The same can be said of Kirin, about whom sparse details and some description have been given across both volumes, but not enough to have a strong sense of her character. At this stage in production, my mindset was essentially that I would draw 3 girls per book, meaning that each book either introduces or reintroduces certain characters who'd get their own art until everyone I wanted to have art did. I knew from the planning that I'd done a couple days after Volume 1 released that I was going to reintroduce both Baila and Kirin as major characters in Volume 3, and so I could draw both of them then. Now, while it's certainly the case that not every light novel will feature art of every single character described in the book in every single book, I think it's probably fair to say that a full roster of character art for the first volume would have likely at least included Baila. And had this been an anime or manga from the beginning, you would almost certainly have gotten to see Baila during the scene where Takuma goes to Crom's manor. If you hadn't gotten to see her in that scene, maybe because her face was hidden by a shroud or something, it would have drawn attention to itself and needed to be mentioned in the original text in order to match the anime canonically, but it doesn't. It was never my intention to hide Baila. I just neither described her in much detail, I never do, nor drew any pictures of her. The reason that illustrations are so core to the existence of light novels is that light novels are built from the same metatextual lexicon as anime, manga, and video games, all visual mediums whose text is inexorably tied to imagery. When we see a character's design in their range of expressions, we learn a shit ton of who they are, but more importantly, we form easy reference points to be made in the text. Light novels, like every other part of nerd culture, are inherently autistic. For the sake of coherency in this argument, we'll be running with the proposition that autism is characterized by shorter neural pathways in the brain. Information is connected rapidly, to the point that blurting out what comes to mind seems incomprehensible to onlookers before extensive, unwanted explanation. That explanation is littered with condensed ideas, keywords, hot links down the proverbial Wikipedia rabbit hole. An autist is a database animal. If I show you a lolly with a certain kind of smirk on her face that you've seen before on other characters with bossy personalities in anime, and then she has that kind of personality in the story, then when I describe the wry smirk spreading across her face, you form a mental image from an amalgam of the character design and the database of expressions which you've seen on other similar characters. This shorthand allows stories to skip over massive amounts of detail and setup and get straight to the point, be that fan service and fight scenes as in most of the medium's drivel, or metatextual, high-minded drivel like we got from the old glory days of the style. Creating short comics for side characters was my way of trying to condense as much of a sense of those characters as I could into as few visual ideas as possible. Take, for instance, Crom and Byla. In the book, we see Byla as a very serious and studious young woman who doesn't give Takuma the time of day. This is expanded on in the comic, where we actually get to see her practicing her magic, and some sense of its strength based on Crom's observations about it. You can see on her face in the second panel exactly how she feels about using this magic, an over-the-top seething energy, almost like she gets off on how badass she is. But then on the next page, the focus shifts to Crom, and we shift into seeing the characters from a new perspective. Crom's inner monologue has more sense of humor than how he presents himself out loud, which I couldn't present from Takuma's first-person perspective that controlled all the scenes that Crom had appeared in the book. We also get to see Byla in a good mood for the first time, the way she refers to her papa being surprisingly cutesy, suggesting a close and unguarded relationship totally unlike what she has with Takuma. It's also this unguarded innocence which makes her comments cut harder. She's completely sincere about looking out for her old dad when she tells him that they don't have to train so hard every day. Crom's reaction, though, is the part that truly takes advantage of illustration the most, because it's an emotion so deeply embroiled into anime and manga's visual lexicon that it's difficult to describe in words and do justice to what it specifically feels like aesthetically. Even when I did my storyboard, the best I could do was to draw the poison lines, as I'm tempted to call them, over Crom's head, along with as close an approximation to the right expression as I could get. Good Vibrations brought the face to life perfectly without needing those poison lines, because he grasped what I was trying to suggest implicitly, as have many of the other artists I've contracted to work on this physical release. Now, in order for you to understand what happened next in my story, I'm going to have to explain an aspect of my career which isn't super obvious. Artists fuck with me hardcore. If you're an artist working in an anime-inspired style, odds are you're an anime fan, putting you in my wheelhouse right from the start. But one of the unique things about my animation analysis is that I'm a lot more interested in understanding visuals than most media critics. I'm not especially educated in how animation is made or in aesthetics in general. In fact, most of what I did was to apply the things I learned from other YouTubers breaking down visuals in film and take that logic to anime. This was low-key by far the biggest influence that I had on anime YouTube. I brought the conversation about visuals forward and defended it massively. A lot of more visually focused channels began to emerge over the years, with the eventual spread of deeper industry knowledge and terminology correctness spreading in undercurrent waves through the writing styles of the anime YouTube community. It also happens that I produce hours and hours of content on a weekly basis, much of which doesn't really require you to look at the screen. And my written content is easily re-listenable. Plus, it doesn't usually have music, so you can play your own over it. All of which means it's ideal to listen to while you draw. The number of artists who have told me that they continually listen to my videos while drawing has got me doing the same thing with other videos. But none of that is the real key. The true kicker is that if you make fan art of me or my characters and send it to me on Twitter, I will retweet it 100% of the time. While my Twitter audience isn't extremely impressive, an artist with 27,000 followers would most likely be doing it as a decent career. If you get put in front of that audience creating something which is relevant to that audience, there's a good chance it's going to get more attention than most of what you post, in addition to the guy you drew basically saying he thinks your shit is cool. It's also a good way to get feedback. Not only will people in my audience respond, and usually they're overwhelmingly nice, but the really good stuff will show itself in the likes and retweets. I am fully aware that I'm opening people up to the experience of seeing their own art get paltry likes while someone else gets plenty, and I hope that it inspires those people to keep trying to improve until they can get similar results. Hell, it might even be just a good way to figure out if your style has mass appeal or not. I learned very early into my career on YouTube, back when I had a tenth of the following that I do now, just how powerful it is to have the camaraderie of artists, and I immediately vowed to make sure I never ever abused this power. Artists are some of the easiest people to abuse because they simply love to draw. Everywhere I looked, I saw YouTubers grinding free labor out of artists and bleeding the passion right out of them, and I vowed that if I worked with anyone on anything serious, the relationship was going to be very clear, and everyone was going to come away feeling fair about it. I also had learned early on that I was truly spoiled for choice when it came to artists. I love tons and tons of the styles of the people who draw art of my stuff, and choosing something out of a sea of options to go with is a risky business, especially speaking as someone who almost never works with people that I don't know personally. Because a large number of my personal friends are skilled artists, I've gone in-house for almost all of the commissions I've used over the course of my career. However, all of my friends are people with their own projects to worry about, and I can't expect them to always have time for as much as I want to ask for. So returning to the story at hand, after publishing Volume 2 on YouTube, I quickly set about planning the KUSOMEGA Kickstarter, and decided on having 12 illustrated pages, 18 pages of comics storyboarded by me and redrawn by other artists, and 4 variant covers. I knew I could get a different artist to handle each of these roles, and I thought it would probably take from 3 to 7 days to fill them all. It took 2. But before I could get there, I had to draw all these storyboards, and that was an adventure in and of itself. I don't know if it comes through in their odd layouts, but I haven't really planned any of these comics before I started drawing. I approached each one starting with an introduction to a scene that I wanted, and then I figured out how that story could reach a resolution with a beat for impact in the middle within the page space that I had to tell it. Creating every single comic felt experimental and fascinating. I was always presenting myself with the problem of an opening panel and then slowly working out a solution to the end point, with different amounts of the story already figured out ahead each time. I finally felt like I'd done enough drawing from reference to have a decent sense of how to convey anatomy and perspective freehand, at least enough so that you could tell what the hell I was trying to show you. I used almost no references in any of these storyboards. I'd been given confidence by a 13-page comic storyboard which I designed in early 2019 that never saw release anywhere, but which I had been very proud of, and so I set about drafting all these storyboards and had an incredible time. Before I knew it, my initial plan to just draw a couple of them for now to test the waters had become the completion of all the storyboards. And now, unintentionally, I had found myself at a point where all I had to do was an afternoon's worth of setup and I could go ahead and get people drawing. The sooner the better, right? So I went ahead and opened up applications for the project. For the next 2 days, I was glued to my inbox. It was a non-stop thrill ride of awesome artists and unexpected takes on my work. Tons of people had drawn my characters before, tons more drew up drafts of what they wanted to do before sending their application. Some were practically finished. And had to be left out because I'd already given the role to someone else who had already made their own amazing pitch. I was contacted by almost 100 artists in the span of 2 days. Most of them were great, and most of them had to be turned down. The ones I hired all had styles or ideas that I loved, and some of those people burned through their work like it was nothing. And that brings me back to Good Vibrations. When I first launched the applications, he offered to do all of the work for free. I turned that down, not just because of earlier discussed principles, but also because a big part of this is my desire to feature different styles and interpretations as part of the work. It's precisely because I can't pick any one of these styles as the most definitive for the series, and because I want to see how these characters can be transformed and shown from new angles in the hands of other artists, that I want all this art to go into the project. But that doesn't mean I can't vibe with someone who's down to crunch the way old Digibro likes to crunch. The fact that Good Vibrations had sketches of my comic done by the next night, literally taking my storyboards and giving them the technical finesse to communicate their message better, made me feel like it would be a waste to pass on such an opportunity to work with someone so willing and capable to bring something bigger to life. It so happens that my plan for the Kickstarter included a 12-page bonus comic, which I didn't want to make someone draw before I had fully secured their payment for it. But since he wanted to do this one way or another anyways and was plowing through what I'd already given him, I thought, fuck it, let's storyboard the Mahou Shoujo Gil comic too. And so I did. Making this 12-page storyboard across the next 3 nights took about as much time as writing the whole first book of the light novel. I handled each 2 pages as a unit, telling short stories which comprised the bigger story of the issue. Ultimately, it's just a cute little action comic with a very straightforward plot that brings us into the narrative of what's going to be happening in Volume 3. After drawing Mahou Shoujo Gil, I started to realize I was getting it. I wasn't drawing these storyboards out of an obligation to make these ideas happen. In fact, as stated before, none of the storyboards I've drawn have been bred from plans. They were imagined in the same way that my story has been, one panel and page at a time with a vague notion of where it ends up and in how long. Drawing these storyboards is fun. Making up stories which can utilize the power of visuals is fun. I actually want to do it just for the hell of it and want to get better. Not because I want to impress anyone, but because I want to be able to tell deeper stories. Because of the ultra-thick, imprecise lines I use in my work, I struggle to convey more specific detail. In order to sell an expression, I have to make it more extreme and wacky because I can't draw well enough to convey it with subtlety. When I design a character, I can only give them a few key pieces of clothing without much detail because I don't have space within the lines to add that detail without cluttering the drawing, and most likely those details will come out muddy. These are problems you can only solve with practice, and for the first time I actually think I have the capacity to practice drawing. Just being able to shift the responsibility of my work's quality away from the detail of an individual illustration and onto the relationships and interactions of images in a comic has given me the ability to create things I actually like enough to make drawing feel like something productive and fun. So naturally, when I finished and handed over the Mahou Shoujo Gil storyboards, I went right on drawing more comics, just for myself. And at this point, I realized that comics were becoming inexorably tied to the identity of KUSOMEGA in my mind, since I'd by now spent just as much time figuring out how to tell stories in this universe through that medium as I've spent on doing the same in writing. I've also just straight up been writing the 3rd volume pretty quickly at the same time. With how much I already pre-planned the story and how well I've come to understand my goals with it, writing is not difficult, and stopping to resolve certain stoppages by realizing characters visually through comics has helped me to understand what I'm trying to make even better. I am literally practicing what I preach and using the explicit themes of the story as a guideline for how to create it. Indeed, as I called attention to in the afterword of the YouTube version of Volume 2, KUSOMEGA is primarily a story about storytelling itself, and the system of lower deck magic is pretty obviously an extended metaphor about different artistic mediums. These themes will come even more to the front in the coming volumes, but a big part of the idea is to show how forming a foundation cobbled together from your understanding of the commonalities between lots of different languages allows you to create new spells through their combinations. So let's propose that KUSOMEGA as a light novel series, which I write in WordPad and on Drive documents, is Earth Magic. Earth Magic has a lot of crossover properties with plant magic, analytical writing. And so while a lot of my knowledge of Earth Magic comes from reverse engineering the principles of plant magic, I am also able to create new kinds of spells through the combination of both magics, and as long as the elements I use are compelling, then the story is compelling as well. So I've also got some decent wind magic skills, oration, which I've grinded making audio content. How can this magic be incorporated into a spell with the other magic? Obviously, this is how the audiobook comes to be. So what elements of every type of magic can I incorporate into KUSOMEGA? Here is a list of ideas. First and foremost, the physical release. This will already be a mixed media project involving comics and illustrations from other artists, but it will also have art in its framework. I am obsessed with the form and format of especially physical media, and I have more in mind for KUSOMEGA's physical design than just pumping in illustrations. I want specific design for the table of contents, for the extras section, and for the layout of the text, unique afterwards and the like. I want the physical release to feel almost like a magazine, a truly collaborative experiment to realize one vision from a bunch of specific angles. God, that sounds pretentious. In any case, there will ideally be 3 physical books, Volume 1+2, Volume 3, and Volume 4, each following similar formats with their own little experiments and places. If possible, I'd also like to create a cardboard art box to house the trilogy. The audio version could potentially be cut into a more complete series of MP3s for each chapter, or even released on a CD as an audiobook, if there was interest. I could also look into the potential of creating side story audio dramas. One of my Kickstarter stretch goals is for a fan art book, an official release of a huge deluge of KUSOMEGA fan art. There's already a fan art page on the website which collects all of the stuff that gets posted on Twitter, but money would be involved in the art book. Some sort of long-form analytical deep dive into the series once it's over might be cool. I want to see as much analytical writing from fans as possible, but there's also just so goddamn much I could say about this series, and I know there are some people who'd be interested in my own perspective on all of it as the author. More comics! Eventually, I think this will lead to the publication of one or more full-blown manga collections. The story just leaves so much room for comics as a possibility for expanding on it that I think it's worth getting all I can out of it. In particular, the way that the story expands in Volume 3 will leave a lot of doors open for side stories. Some kind of video game! One of the artists who applied for the series had a style I thought would be perfect for a KUSOMEGA game, so I realized I had to make one. No idea what it would amount to, I don't even want to think about it until a significant amount of the other stuff is done. Every time I make a story, people joke about making it into an anime. Some people even animated small clips of the first book. I think the potential for telling side stories through animation is just as strong as it is in the comics, but animation is such a huge undertaking that I'd need to learn a lot more about my avenues into getting it created before I could be sure I was going to go through with it. That said, I'm not discounting the possibility of simply attempting some rudimentary animated shorts myself. Music is a tough one. I'm not that interested in putting together an official soundtrack, but it might be interesting to try and make a character album. Maybe this could also be a big collab project. It's hard to say at this point, but I do have at least one idea for a character theme that I want to make myself. I don't even begin to know how I would get this done, but if KUSOMEGA reaches a level of popularity where a limited figurine run seems like it could be worthwhile, I would absolutely love to make that happen. Probably I would hold some kind of design contest and have people vote on which one they wanted adapted into a figure. And of course, there's plenty of other merchandising opportunities out there, basic stuff like buttons, pins, stickers, whatever. Each of these presents an opportunity for storytelling and creativity. KUSOMEGA is a story about pushing yourself, trying new things, and evolving as a creator and as a person, and I think it only makes sense to try and reflect those themes in the way that the story is actually constructed. In the end, the singular tree of KUSOMEGA will most likely be the website. All of the branches will be displayed there for you to explore at your leisure. Remember, it's not about being clever, it's about moving forward. And that's all. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Go to the KUSOMEGA website, kusomega.com. That is where you can find everything related to the series linked to. So that's your portal to explore this world I'm building of increasing complexity. See you around.